Chapter 10. Darcon. Anger and worry were all he was capable of. As one day followed the next, each intensified in their own right until they seemed like the only emotions he could muster anymore. They clung to him like soot, dogging his footsteps and leaving behind a thick black cloud that lingered in the air wherever he went. They wouldn't let him see Mina, even now, days after the accident, although the other initiates had begun buzzing that she was awake and healing. Everyone called it a miracle. They said that she had been on the brink of death, pulled away from the edge by Mistress Geraldine's skillful treatments. There were other murmurings. Rumors spread in hushed voices in the dead of night that something had happened to her. The whispering spoke of wild visions and tormented screams coming from the infirmary. The screams of a madwoman. That sort of speculation was heavily discouraged, of course, met with sharp looks and stern punishments by the master disciples. But that didn't do anything to temper the rumors. If anything, it encouraged them further. Some claimed it was battle fatigue, while others insisted Mistress Geraldine had burrowed too deeply into Mina's skull and dislodged something important. Still, others believed Mina had just snapped, lost touch with reality in the aftermath of the injury. But the one thing their stories all had in common was that Mina of 10 Keeps saw things. Concern for his friend was what plagued him as he reached the landing, one hand lingering on the banister as he stared up at the telescope. A piece of its brass outer shell had been knocked loose when Mina struck it, exposing the intricate network of mirrors within. It made his own head ache to think about how hard she must have hit the device, and fresh anger bubbled up inside him. Someone, presumably Master Disciple Adriana, had draped a small tarp over the eyepiece until it could be fixed, but that did nothing to erase the evidence of the skirmish. The blood had long since been cleaned, of course, but the floor tiles were broken, cleaved in two by a pulse of incomprehensible force. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring, but eventually the sound of a throat clearing made him look up. His mentor, Master Disciple Nagus, stood in the doorway, his expression somber. "Darcon," he said. "I was looking for you." "Sorry," the young initiative replied in a flat voice. "I got lost in thought." Nagus didn't respond, his eyes drifting around. Few disciples had been in here since the accident, and an oppressive pall seemed to have been cast over the room. Unable to stand the silence any longer, Darcon asked, "What did you need?" "The elders have gathered in the infirmary," Nagus replied. "They want to speak with you." Darcon's insides turned to ice. "Any idea what they want?" he questioned, as if he couldn't guess. "I haven't the foggiest," Nagus replied, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure we'll know soon enough." He averted his eyes, and that was the final nail in the coffin. Darcon would have preferred it if he were angry with him. At least then he wouldn't have had to see the flash of disappointment that had crossed his mentor's face. They made their way out through the courtyard in silence, passing other initiates as they went. A few of them gave Darcon pitying looks, while others scoffed and rolled their eyes. Word had spread about how he'd lost his scroll, that much was obvious, but he did his best to ignore the way they whispered as he approached. The infirmary was crowded when they arrived. Several others were clustered in the small space, talking in low voices and shooting the occasional glance at Mina, who was sitting at the head of her bed. A leather blindfold, roughly cut into a narrow strip, was pulled tightly around her eyes. Master Disciple Lennox stood across from her, his face lined with concern. All 3 temple elders were there, Snowthorn sitting in a chair by the far wall, Nynx leaning heavily on her walking stick beside him, and Sloke nestled in his own bed amidst his mound of pillows. "Min," Darcon said, hurrying towards her, his heart leaping in his chest. "Darcon?" She moved her head this way and that, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Yes," he assured her, coming to a stop by her bedside and reaching for her small hand. She gave a small smile of appreciation as he knelt down beside her. "How are you?" he spoke in a low voice and glanced in the direction of the debating elders. "What is all this?" Mina was silent for a moment, her grip on his hand tightening ever so slightly. "It's about me," she replied. She swallowed hard. "I've been having visions, Darcon." She turned in his direction, desperation creeping into her voice. "They must think I've gone mad." "You haven't," he assured her. "You're not crazy, Min." "Aren't I?" She gestured feebly at a blindfold with her free hand. "You haven't seen what I've seen, Darcon." A pang of anxiety stirred within him. He couldn't remember his friend ever sounding this afraid. "What have you seen?" Mina took an unsteady breath, and as she stared blankly in his direction, Darcon was struck by the notion that she could still see him, somehow, through the blindfold. Ridiculous, of course. "Death," she replied, her voice so small it was almost inaudible. "That's not," Darcon began, but he was interrupted by Snowthorn's approach. The elder moved at a glacial pace, as he would until next year's hibernation. Such were the consequences of awakening a tundra elf early. He would pay for his loss of slumber with 8 months of lethargy. "It's magic," he said as he arrived at the foot of Mina's bed. "That much is obvious." "Or it's madness," Elder Nynx responded. "Head injuries can do things like this to people." "Have you ever seen a madness like this?" Master Disciple Linux retorted. "Visions of death and destruction, specific to the person she's looking at." Darcon glanced back at Mina, his eyes going wide, but he didn't dare interrupt. Was that why she had covered her eyes? "No," Nynx acknowledged. "I haven't." "Even if her affliction itself isn't magical," Elder Sloke pointed out, "the accident that caused it was. Mina herself said the man used some kind of spell on her, and there were traces of magic left over in the observatory even after it happened. For Celestriona's sake, what else could have broken the floor like that?" "Then there must be some way of curing it," Elder Nynx reasoned. Darcon straightened up. "Is that what this is about?" he asked, suddenly hopeful. "A cure?" Linux rounded on him then, his eyes blazing. "I don't want to hear a word from you," he snapped. "We didn't bring you here because we wanted your advice. This was all your fault." "Linux," Elder Sloke cautioned, but his aged voice didn't carry the weight needed to deter Mina's mentor. Pointing at Darcon accusingly, Linux turned to the others. "Why is he even here? Who let him in?" "I did," Nagus spoke up, looking to the elders for backup. "You said you wanted to see him." "We'll get to that in a moment," Elder Nix said, holding up a hand to calm them. "But first, we need to determine what's to be done with Mina." Linux sighed. "We can't just let her suffer like this. She needs help, the kind of help that we can't give her." He thought for a moment. "We need to put the word out to every mage in the vicinity. Anyone who has expertise with this kind of affliction can come take a look at her." "And let strangers trade peas through the temple unsupervised," Elder Nynx shook her head wearily. "That's exactly how this mess happened in the first place." "Then what do you suggest?" Sloke asked. "I suggest we summon one of our guardians," Nynx replied, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. Master Disciple Nagus sucked in a breath. "Are you sure?" Darcon looked from Mina to the elders and back again. Under different circumstances, the prospect of meeting a celestial dragon would have made him excited beyond belief. To see one in person, to witness the splendor that awaited him if he ascended, was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They were exceedingly rare even here, and his stomach should have been fluttering in anticipation. Instead, he felt nothing but dread. After the way he'd messed up, he doubted he would be allowed to attend any such meeting. Besides, he was sitting here listening to the others discuss Mina like she was nothing more than a curiosity, a specimen on a scholar's desk. "I suppose it's worth a try," Sloke admitted. "Do you know if there are any around?" "Lunar would be the logical choice," Nynx responded. "But I'm not sure where she is at the moment. There may be others, though. The only issue is time. Depending on their orientation in the sky, they could take weeks, if not months, to arrive." "Then we'll need to do something else," Elder Snowthorn said, stifling a yawn. "Find someone who specializes in magical mishaps." "If you're talking about the conjuring," Lennox began. Darcon's stomach dropped. Surely they weren't actually considering this. The conjuring would be of no help. At best, they would brandish their laws and spout hot air. At worst, hells. They might want to study her, take her away from the temple. He turned to stare at Mina. She was facing straight ahead, her expression unreadable beneath her blindfold. "Maybe they've seen this kind of thing before," Snowthorn pointed out. "Besides, you're forgetting the most obvious problem. We're required to report any magic-related incidents, especially when they result in..." He hesitated. "Casualties." "My student isn't a casualty," Lennox all but shouted. That was when Mina spoke up for the first time. "If I may," she said quietly, in a voice that hardly sounded like her own. The others turned to her, but only Elder Sloke responded. Yes, Mina. She cleared her throat, pulling her hand free of Darcon's as she straightened up. We need to follow the laws of the land, she said, slowly, pressing her lips together. I don't want the Order to get in trouble over me. Elder Sloke's brows pulled together. You needn't concern yourself with such matters, Mina. Whatever happens, we will handle it. But Mina was already shaking her head, sending a fresh pang of anguish through Darcon's chest. She wasn't actually thinking of going along with this, was she? It would be one thing if you didn't know what had happened, Mina said. But you do, and that means if you conceal me, you're all culpable. She took a shaky breath, rubbing absently at her arms. Whatever they do to me will look like child's play compared to what they'll do to you if they find you hid me from them. That's a gray area, Lennox protested, looking to Elder Sloke for support. As a religious organization, we're technically outside of their jurisdiction. Do you really think that argument will hold up if they come knocking at our door, Lennox? Snowthorn replied. We may be exempt from their taxes, but we're not exempt from their laws. Why? Lennox shot back. Are you going to tell them? We have to, Mina protested, growing agitated. Their order will get in trouble. She turned back to Darcon, as if willing him to say something, but he stayed silent. He couldn't support this, not if it meant potentially losing the only person he cared about in this damned place. There was a beat, and then Sloke gave a rattling chuckle. It figures you would say that, Mina, he said, not unkindly, but clearly not taking her seriously either. You're still recuperating, and you've been through unimaginable trauma these past few days. Respectfully, you can hardly take it upon yourself to determine what's best for the temple. But, Mina began. Elder Sloke has a point, Nix agreed. It's too early to make a decision, especially one with such far-reaching consequences. We need time to think this over, and you need time to get your strength back. Perhaps this matter will resolve itself. It was clear from her expression that she didn't believe it. Master-disciple Lennox gave a brisk nod, and his relief was palpable. That settles it, then. We'll reach out to Lunar. It's not quite settled, Elder Snowthorn said. There's still the matter of the boy. The boy? Darcon froze. This is why I was summoned. Master-disciple Nagas, who up until now had been silent, took a step forward. I assume this relates to my student's action on the day of the attack. Don't talk about me like I'm not here, Darcon snapped, getting to his feet. He should have known this was coming. Even to his own ears, there was a sheen of fear to the outrage in his voice, and that only made it worse. Oh, believe me, I haven't forgotten that. Mina's mentor snapped, his face twisting in disgust as he turned to Darcon. Not since you cost our artillery box and nearly got my best student killed. He wasn't the one to cast the spell, Lennox, Elder Sloke reminded him gently. Darcon shot him a grateful look. He might as well have, Lennox insisted. None of this would have happened if it weren't for him. He was incapacitated, Master-disciple Nagas argued, coming to stand beside Darcon. The thief used some kind of black market spell to knock him out. He couldn't have intervened even if he'd known what was happening. Yes, you've told us about the glyph several times, Nagas, Lennox replied. It wouldn't have been a problem if Darcon had bothered to escort the thief back outside per your instructions, he scoffed, shaking his head and gesturing Darcon's way. He didn't listen to you. How can you keep supporting him? Because he's my student. Silence! Silence! Elder Nix shouted, rapping her walking stick against the stone tiles. I won't see us turn into a pack of hyenas. She shuffled her feet, sighing. The exertion of standing up was obviously wearing on her. It is indeed true that such missteps cannot be waved off. She turned to Darcon. We have been told you lost your constellation scroll. Is this true? Darcon bristled, his ears turning red. I didn't lose it. It was stolen. The finer points aren't the issue in matters such as this, Elder Snowthorn said in a tired voice. Constellation scrolls are the cornerstone of our order, impossible to replicate. You took a vow to protect yours with your life when you arrived here, and again when it was drawn up. Is that not correct? Yes, Darcon admitted, and it is no longer in your possession. I don't see why this is the only transgression up for discussion, Master Disciple Lennox spoke up. Darcon could have throttled him. The damage you've caused alone is grounds for expulsion from the Order. That took the wind out of Darcon's sails, and it must have been obvious, because Lennox only doubled down on his attack. You gave an unvetted visitor the chance to wander the temple grounds when you were explicitly told not to let him out of your sight. If you'd followed your orders, all of this could have been avoided. He paused, and added, "A single star changes the whole night sky." Elder Sloke gave a put-upon sigh, his expression regretful. "Lennox has a point," he acknowledged. "Losing your constellation scroll calls for automatic excommunication. In light of the other problems that have come as a result of your actions, the choice is unfortunately clear." Wait a minute. Panic raged within him, creeping into his voice. To his right, Mina had gone pale, her hand flying back out to seize him by the arm. "You're saying you're kicking me out? For something I didn't even do?" "It would have to be put to a vote, of course," Elder Snowthorn acknowledged. "You already know what I think," Lennox growled. "Seeing as the Temple High Charter sets the precedent, and the initiate in question isn't your student, you won't be given a vote, Master Disciple," Elder Nynx told him, "although your opinion is duly noted." "Then I want my objection noted as well," Nagus snapped, glaring daggers at Lennox. "Very well," Elder Nynx acknowledged. "Wait," Darcon said, glancing frantically from one elder to the next. "This couldn't be happening. Not so fast. Not so soon. Can't we talk about this? We can work something out. Some other punishment, maybe. You can't just kick me out like this." And then, as horrifying as it was inevitable, he heard himself start to beg, his voice like a frightened boy's. Please don't do this." Elder Nynx cleared her throat, her expression grim. "I'm sorry, Darcon, but mistakes, no matter their origins, carry consequences. The traditions are clear." She turned to the other elders. "All those in favor of excommunication." "Aye," Elder Snowthorn replied flatly. "Aye," Elder Nynx echoed, sealing the majority. She turned to Sloke, who was watching the proceedings with an expression of disgust on his wrinkled face. "Elder Sloke?" "Opposed," Sloke replied, his watery eyes drifting to Darcon. "Enough tragedy has come of this already. There's nothing to be gained from kicking him out." Darcon gave him a weak smile, but his gratitude was short-lived. The majority ruled, and there was nothing more the sick and generous old man could say to defend him. "Noted," Elder Nynx said, pausing just long enough to look from him back to Snowthorn. "It's decided, then." Darcon's ears began to ring, a sense of unreality settling over him as he tried and failed to process what he was hearing. For her part, Mina was already scrambling to get up, blindly fumbling for purchase, and Lennox had to gently but firmly push her back down. "Elder Sloke, please," she begged, looking frantically around the room. "Don't let them do this. It wasn't Darcon's fault. Surely you can see that." "Mina," Sloke replied, sounding exhausted. "I'm outnumbered." "Please," she repeated, her throat tightening. "He's my only friend." Tears, hot and angry, pricked at Darcon's eyes as he fought to maintain his dignity. His throat was thick, his breathing ragged, and the pain in Mina's voice was like a knife to the chest. "I'm sorry, child," Sloke said, his voice as ancient and unyielding as the rules he followed. "My hands are tied." Heaving a sigh, he returned his attention to his fellow elders and yielded to formality. "I concede." Just like that, his only hope was extinguished, blown out like a candle. "I'm sorry, Min," he said, his voice breaking. It was all he could say without losing what little composure he had left. "Darcon," Elder Nynx said, "you are hereby expelled from the Order of Celestriona. We hope that the next path you walk leads you somewhere brighter." Darcon opened his mouth, but no words came out. Anger and devastation roared within him as he searched for something, some rationalization, maybe, or some last-minute argument that would convince them to overturn their decision. But there was nothing. Beside him, Mina was sobbing quietly, while Master Disciple Lennox eyed him with a joyfully vindictive expression. His lips pulling back in a grimace, Darcon backed up a pace, and then two, before running from the room. As he fled, Lennox's voice carried after him through the open infirmary doors. "That boy has been nothing but trouble since we took him in," he was saying, more spiteful than victorious. "Good riddance." Grief overwhelmed him as he retreated down the hallway where, not so long ago, he had fought Warred and Tidar with his bare hands. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. He had thrown his body, mind, and spirit into this place. How many hours had he spent practicing? How many strained muscles, broken bones, and bruised knuckles had he sustained? How many nights had he spent hunched over dry, dusty tomes, all in the hopes that he would one day be reborn in Celestriona's domain? That thought brought him to an abrupt halt at the end of the corridor, and this time, there was no stopping the tears. He rubbed furiously at his eyes, self-hatred overwhelming him as the truth descended on him like a rain of arrows, each one striking harder than the last. He stood there for a long time, his head in his hands, his chest tight with frustration and sadness. Without his constellation scroll, he would never be allowed back into the Order, and without the temple, he could never ascend. His questing was over, forever lost to him before he had even started, and there was nothing he could do about it. Chapter 11. Mina. She didn't see Darcon again for more than 3 days, when a quiet tapping at the infirmary door heralded his arrival. It was so close to dawn that the only other sound was Elder Sloke's soft snoring. It had been long enough that she had begun to fear her friend had left without saying goodbye, a final insult on top of the fear and heartbreak that had dogged her footsteps ever since the accident 8 days ago. She couldn't even blame him if he had. She might as well have been a leper, tainted by a curse without name or explanation. The nights seemed to melt into each other, and although the physical pain dwindled little by little, the mental pain only grew more acute. Mistress Geraldine suggested that the vertigo might have been due to the trephining, but Mina knew better. It wasn't brain damage that set her head spinning and her stomach churning whenever she took off the blindfold. It was looking at other people. More specifically, it was looking at the grisly visions of death that accompanied them wherever they went. It was like a nightmare from which she couldn't awake, macabre shadow plays dancing on every wall and lurking in front of every familiar face. She now knew that the cook, a lambkin named Rona, who fixed the meals for the entire temple, would one day die of an infected cut. She knew that the initiate who had come to the infirmary with a broken finger the morning before would be left for dead by raiders within the next few years. She had witnessed Mistress Geraldine fall down the mountain stairs more times than she could count, and nothing, she told herself, changed the image of Sloke's flickering corpse that greeted her whenever she looked his way. Was it insanity? A curse? Or was it something far more sinister? Far more incomprehensible? Tonight was easier than most. The blindfold blocked the hallucinations and lessened the dizziness. Although the roaring headaches were still there, along with the sharp, near-constant throbbing at the side of the incision above her ear, she would take those over the visions any day. She was even up and walking again, but she never strayed far from the infirmary. Mistress Geraldine wanted to keep her under observation. That was fine by Mina. She knew what the other initiates were saying about her behind closed doors, about how the accident had turned her mind to mush. Even the master disciple seemed doubtful of her grasp on reality. But they hadn't seen what she had seen. These were the thoughts that were plaguing her when Darcon arrived. She was sitting on the ledge by the bay window that overlooked the temple grounds, her blindfold loose around her neck and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Outside, the craggy cliffs dropped abruptly away to reveal the sheer, untamable mountainside. This had once been a coveted place for stargazing, and she could picture the pinpricks of light overhead, invisible to her now amidst that vast, impenetrable darkness. It took the sound of Darcon clearing his throat to bring her out of melancholic musings. Donning her blindfold, she turned in his direction. "Hey," he said in his warm voice, and she could almost envision him, hunched slightly in that boyish way of his hands tucked into the pockets of his linen pants. "Hey," Mina echoed, forcing a smile that chafed against the rough leather over her eyes. Oh, it chafed. "Hey," Mina echoed, forcing a smile that chafed against the rough leather over her eyes. "I thought you might have left already." "Without saying goodbye? Never," Darcon replied, his voice drawing closer as he shuffled toward her. "Master Disciple Nagas sent a babblebird to Bragon. He's on his way from the Dark River clan. The temple leaders are allowing me to stay until he arrives to pick me up. He's a fast traveler, but it may be at least another week before he gets here. There was a moment's pause, and his breath hitched. They don't want me visiting you again. But it's not like they have me under guard. Yet. Mina swallowed hard. Why don't they want you to see me? She managed. Darcon sighed. They haven't told me. Punishment, I guess. Or your morale, maybe. Master Disciple Lennox still thinks you can be... He stopped short. But Mina knew what he'd been about to say. Fixed, she finished for him, sighing. He still thinks I can be fixed. There was a long pause, and then Darcon moved closer, taking her hand. His skin was warm against hers, which now seemed perpetually cold and clammy. Mina, I'm so sorry, he rasped, guilt and frustration warring in his voice. This was all my fault, just like the elders said. It wasn't, Mina insisted, although she couldn't help but wonder, not for the first time, what might have happened if he hadn't put his faith in that dark-eyed stranger. None of this is your fault, Darcon. It just happened. Wasn't that the cruel joke of it? That it had all just happened without rhyme or reason? Still, Darcon continued glumly, letting go of her hand, it shouldn't have. Mina hesitated, already missing the anchoring sensation of his touch. She changed the subject, not wanting to project more of her pain onto him. Do you think Brygon might bring someone with him? She ventured, hardly daring to hope. Another Augor, maybe? Someone who could take a look at me. She held her breath, wishing she could see his reaction. The Augurist clans were spread far and wide across the continent, seeking answers in the natural world to life's greatest mysteries. Magic was deeply ingrained in their culture, regardless of clan, and if there were ever a time for their advice, it was now. Darcon exhaled. I don't think so, he replied at last. According to the reply the Babblebird brought back, he'll have to leave the conclave without permission in order to come get me. Mina's heart sank, but she supposed she shouldn't have been expecting a magical cure-all. Won't that get him in trouble? Maybe, Darcon responded. But we're brothers. I would do the same for him if our roles were reversed. Right, Mina said softly. Of course he would. It was strange hearing the bird talk with his voice, but I didn't realize how much I really missed him until that moment. They sat in silence for a moment longer, before Darcon straightened up. I should go, he said. If the Master Disciples find me here, they'll be upset. He paused, adding grimly, more upset. I might not even get to wait for Brygon if they catch me in here. He turned to go, but Mina jumped to her feet. Wait, she protested, already fumbling with her blindfold. I've already started to forget what you look like. She gave him a weird smile, but in truth, she was only half joking. Are you sure? Darcon asked, uncertain. I'm sure, Mina replied, fighting the tremor in her voice. Unease gripped her, but she fended it off. This might be the last time she would ever see the rambunctious, headstrong boy she'd been friends with all these years, the only other initiate who had looked past her stature to see the person inside. Steeling herself, Mina pulled the leather from her eyes. Darcon stood a few paces away. That same crooked smile was on his face, but it was tinged with a kind of disappointed cynicism that broke her heart in two. The vertigo set her head spinning and her ears ringing, and the smile on her lips vanished, a mere moment later, chased away by a rush of panic that made her heart seize in her chest. No, she thought. Please, Celestriona, no! But her prayer fell on deaf ears. A smoky image was already roaring up in front of Darcon, as dark and fluid as freshly spilled oil. There he was, standing in the middle of a cobblestone road as he battled a trio of shadow opponents. Darcon blocked their blows and returned them in kind, but he was outnumbered. Someone else lay on the ground amidst the chaos, but whether they were friend or foe, Mina didn't know. What she did know, however, was that one of the phantoms was holding a knife, his eyes burning like two hot coals. Nearby, on a horse, she recognized one other figure. It was the thief, the man from her nightmare, the man who had stolen the armillary box and flung her into the telescope, the man she had foreseen being obliterated by a dragon in a wave of unparalleled destruction. Mina tried to scream, but no sound came out, even as the man with the dagger crept up behind Darcon with his blade raised. Her voice remained dead in her throat. The knife flashed, black blood splattered, and Darcon dropped to his knees. When the whole thing started up again, Mina realized she was crying, wishing she could unsee it, and feeling like an idiot for looking. She'd been expecting a vision of death, not of murder. What was the point of seeing his face one last time if this was what came with it? And it was so close, so vivid. It would happen soon. "Min?" Darcon exclaimed, rushing back to her as the shadow vision replayed. "Mina, what is it? What's wrong?" Her mouth opened and closed, throat as dry as a desert. Mina managed. "Someone is going to stab you in the back, Darcon." Darcon's eyebrows shot up, but he gave her a look that was probably meant to be reassuring. "That figures," he said dryly. "It feels like everyone wants to do that to me these days." "Darcon, I'm serious," she protested. "You're going to die. Soon."
"Mina," Darcon sighed, "you don't know that."
"Don't you know what I've seen?" she cried, resisting the urge to shake him by the shoulders. "Haven't you heard the master disciples? I see how people are going to die." Gritting her teeth, she tried desperately to focus on the boy and not the vision in front of him. "And I just saw your death too." Darcon shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "He doesn't believe me," she realized with dismay. "He won't say it because he has a good heart. He doesn't think it's true. Maybe it isn't true." But the thought brought her no comfort. She had seen it, just like she had seen the others, and she knew it was true. She understood it on some deeper, more profound level, the same way she understood that the world was round and that the sun set at dusk and rose at dawn. Trembling, she took a step forward. "Someone will kill you, Darcon. I saw it happen. There are 3 of them, and the thief from the observatory will be there, watching. It's his fault." Her expression hardened, and she stared at him with wide, crazed eyes. "He's out to get you, Darcon. He's not going to stop until you're dead." Darcon touched her shoulder, but none of the horror coursing through her was reflected on his face. Instead, his mouth was set in a line of grim determination. It was becoming harder and harder to see him through the vision, and the vertigo that came with it made her stomach roil. She swallowed back bile as he spoke to her.
"I hope he is out to get me." His reply was a growl. "I hope I see him again just so I can drag him back here to face the elders. He needs to be brought to justice for what he's done to me. To you."
Mina took his face in both her hands, and it would be hours before she realized it was the first time she had ever dared to touch him like this. "If you see him, Darcon, you run from him," she said, half ordering and half begging. "Do you hear me?" He actually smiled a little at that, but there was no humor in it as he pulled back and turned toward the door.
"If I see him," Darcon replied slowly, "I'll break his neck."
Chapter 12. Seth. Grease. Why did they have to use so much grease? The pathetic helping of roast duck before him was practically drowning in it, glistening dully in the light of the oil lamps flickering overhead. Ordering any kind of meat, especially at a hole-in-the-wall establishment such as this, had been a mistake. The cellar was no doubt full of shriveled-up fowl, probably hanging there since the last of the platinum dragons had died out. If the other patrons in the dining room felt similarly about their meals, they weren't showing it. Still, their drunken merriment did nothing to ease Seth's black mood. The duck continued to wallow in its puddle of drippings now, starting to congeal in the tepid air, and the longer he stared down at his plate, the more the food turned his stomach. Fire crawled up and down his arms, his skin whispering in a language only it seemed to understand. Helpless to resist, Seth cut himself a piece of duck, chewed it without joy, and choked it down. It settled heavily in his stomach, making him grimace. He hadn't been able to handle anything richer than vegetables and potatoes in the 18 days since he had left the temple, but his markings would have the final say. They always did. He continued to eat in silence, oblivious to the trails and twangs of the harpist's melody, and the animated conversation that carried across the dining room from the few occupied tables. A disjointed sort of misery burned in his chest, and although it hadn't been enough to present the subsequent thefts he carried out over the past weeks, it left him with a lingering seeds of malice that shrank his stomach and kept him from sleeping. They might have burnt his skin beyond repair, but they hadn't eradicated his conscience. Not completely. The feeling struck him with profound intensity. Seth once thought he had inoculated himself against guilt, but he was wrong. It still crept up on occasion, usually at the most inopportune times. He was no stranger to violence. In fact, one might say he had a certain appreciation for a battle well fought, the same way a mathematician might appreciate a particularly vexing problem. It was necessary, a means to an end. So why was his head all tangled up now? It was the girl. It had to be. His thoughts had been in pieces ever since that night at the monastery, his mind creeping relentlessly back to her staring eyes, wide with terror as they saw the unspeakable. The image was impossible to shake, fresh and bright and painful, a sight that made his throat constrict and his blood run cold. 673 times now it had sunk its claws into his heart, and his mind wearing tracks into him, like wagon wheels on an oft-used dirt road. He had spent his first evening back from the temple, thrashing through nightmares, and no amount of wine, women, or music had been able to dull the edge. His guilt sat with him at the table even now as he poked at the greasy duck with his fork, sliding it listlessly around on his plate. Damn it! Seth dropped the fork with an ironstone clatter. He would normally have been 3 servings deep by now. I didn't kill her, he told himself. It was practically becoming a mantra these days. She was hurt, but not dead. Right. Sure. How much pain and destruction had he wrought already? How much more would he wreak before his work was done? Seth pushed his plate away. The Craggy Cliff Tavern and Inn had grown crowded as he sat there stewing like his meal had done not long before. Travelers and tradesmen who traveled and traded their way along the highway were arriving in droves, getting ready to hunker down for the night. By his count, there were 16 others, not including the innkeeper and the serving wench. The air was full of intoxicated shouts, which only grew louder by the minute. Beer foamed in mugs, coins rattled as they changed hands, and the ancient rafters groaned overhead. Grunting, Seth reached down to pick up his discarded fork. He'd done enough ruminating. If he wasn't going to eat, he supposed he should at least get some rest, if only to appease the tattoos. It wouldn't be long before they grew more insistent, and he could sense their urgency the closer he drew to his next destination. They were directing him to an amethyst dragon egg nest. He had deduced it was in the area thanks to a conversation he had overheard between a merchant and a guard 3 days earlier. They had described a patch of forest where no leaves grew on the trees, and the grass was brown and dead despite plentiful rain. No insects chirped, the merchant had claimed. No animals scurried. It was as if all life had been sucked from the land, poisoning the ground and fauna, the very air. The barrenness could have only one cause, of course. The dragon blight of one of the great beast's nests. Unlike the other dragon breeds, amethysts didn't tether their eggs to a singular living victim. Rather, they nested wherever they pleased, letting their unborn children indiscriminately drain the life energy from their surrounding environments. Perhaps they weren't so different from Seth himself in that regard. As was always the case with the items his tattoos made him pursue, Seth had no idea why he needed to steal an egg from one of the most hateful, cunning, and dangerous predators in all of Heavenfall. In fact, he couldn't be completely sure if he really needed to steal one at all. Things within his mind were increasingly muddied of late, a disarray of fragmented memories and half-truths, all overshadowed by that immutable, unshakable need to obey. His skin had led him astray before, sending him chasing down other items that had little, if anything, to do with his mission. Or had they? This was, of course, the all-important question. His pursuit of the amethyst egg had brought him back into the vicinity of the Azoli Valley, far too close to the mountains for his liking. As he cleaned up his abandoned dinner, Seth found himself listening in on a snippet of conversation, which drifted over from a table to his right. 3 heavily armed mercenaries were draining their tankards as quickly as the barmaid could refill them, all the while complaining about their, presumably former, employer. "Let the bastard rot," one of them slurred loudly. "We'll see how long he lasts without our protection." "Not this again," complained the largest of the 3.
He shoved his companion with a lazy hand. "You're not saying anything that hasn't been said already." "Then it needed repeating," insisted the first man, taking a long swig of his ale. "Disorderly. He didn't know shit about shit. What in the bloody world was he expecting, huh?" He gestured with his mug, sending beer sloshing over the side. "We're not some spineless schoolboys, and if that's what he was looking for, he shouldn't have hired us in the first place." "It's your fault, Prior," snapped the third man. "If you hadn't been swilling gin like a keg that sprung a leak." "Mead, not gin," the first shot back. "Besides, a little liquid courage makes me a better fighter. It makes you a sloppy fighter, and it's what got us the boot." "Well, ain't no sense in arguing it," said the second man, holding up his hands and swaying in his seat. "Only thing left is to enjoy the piss that passes for ale here and get some shut-eye. Then we move on. I've heard there's plenty of work to be found in Bellomontis, in the foothills. It's just a few days up the road from here." "And if that son of a whore doesn't want to hire us for protection," the third man mumbled, "we can always do what he hired us to protect him from." The table erupted into a chorus of drunken laughs. Seth grimaced. Yet another reason not to go back to Bellomontis. He was practically back within spitting distance of the temple as it was. Gathering up his backpack, he set it on the bench beside him, checked that his longsword was still leaning against the table, and was on the verge of getting up when the tavern door swung open again. A gust of warm evening air ruffled his dark locks, but when he looked up in the direction of the new arrival, a chill ran down his back. "It can't be," he thought, trying not to stare yet unable to help himself. There, standing in the doorway, their clothes rumpled from the wind, were Bragon and Darcon. Chapter 13. Mina. The icy water left Mina gasping against the cold as it trickled frigid rivulets down her neck. The wash basin in the corner of the infirmary was fed directly by the snowmelt on the upper slopes of Mount Basridden, and no matter how many times she used it to clean her face, she could never quite get used to the temperature. Grabbing the sponge from where it lay next to her discarded blindfold, she dunked it once, wrung it out, and dabbed it gingerly against the surgical wound above her ear, which was healing nicely, all things considered. She hadn't shaved her head in a while. Her black hair was starting to grow back, but maintaining an orderly appearance was the last of her concerns, at least until she no longer had a hole in her skull. Idly, she wondered what she looked like, but there were no mirrors in the sick room, and she was too scared to ask for one. She feared what she would see, what dark visions might lurk in the glass. Would she be met with a vision of her own death, swimming like smoke across her reflection? Some things, she was rapidly discovering, were better left unknown. Darcon was long gone, and Mina felt his absence more with each passing day. Bragon, true to his word, had come to collect his twin, but there had been no fanfare, no grand send-off for the disgraced initiate. They had simply disappeared into the morning. Now she only had herself, and the longer she spent in her own head, the worse she felt. Her only distractions were Sloke, who grew gauntier by the day, and mundane tasks such as the one she was performing right now. At least washing her face allowed her an excuse to take off her blindfold. As if of their own accord, her eyes traveled to Sloke, drawn to the apparition that materialized over him, a specter of his last moments that blocked out the real man. Just like every time before, the phantom image of the elder gasped and struggled amidst the cushions, as if that would somehow save him from the clutches of death. Mina had made a point not to look at him ever since that first vision, but now she found that she couldn't look away, as much as she wanted to. The vision of Sloke's death caught her like a rabbit in a snare. Transfixed in spite of her horror, she saw that this time, the shadow image was even clearer than it had been before. As easily as the vision had come, a thought followed it. Tonight. It's going to happen tonight. Mina stared at the old man, slumbering in the shadow of mortality, the vertigo making her stomach churn. That was when Sloke's eyes opened. He raised an incredulous eyebrow, the corners of his mouth quirking upwards. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Mina," he teased, but his smile faded when he saw the look on her face. "That was a poor choice of words." That, at last, pulled her from her daze, and she dragged her eyes away, fumbling on the wash basin for her discarded blindfold. Her ears had started to ring, and she felt as though she might kneel over. Again, that thought, or was it a premonition, echoed in her mind like a distant call from the bottom of a dark pit. It's going to happen tonight.
She gripped the marble ledge so hard that her knuckles turned white, and when she replied, her voice didn't sound like her own. "It really doesn't bother you?" she asked. "What doesn't bother me?" "Death. Don't look at him again, whatever you do." The relief that surged through her once she got the blindfold back in place was palpable. "Your death." Elder Sloak sighed, the sigh of an old man who had long since resigned himself to his fate. "Of course it bothers me," he replied, "but there's no escaping it, is there? I missed my chance. I would be soaring on starry wings right now, eternal and free of death's clutches, if I had done what was asked of me. Instead, I frittered away the time I was given." He shifted in his bed. "There's nothing for it now, though." "So that's it?" Mina asked, swallowing hard. She didn't know what she was searching for. Wisdom, maybe? Or some kind of reassurance that things weren't as black and white as they seemed. But Sloak gave her none of those things. "That's it," he echoed. "I'm facing the consequences of a life spent doing things my own way. I chose my path, just like you will have to choose yours." He paused, and when he spoke again, Mina had the sense that he was watching her. "Something tells me that time will come sooner than you think." Those were the last words he had ever said to her. Elder Sloak died just before midnight. He thrashed amongst his sheets, one hand on his chest as he struggled for breath, and several agonizing moments passed before his body went limp. When he at last grew still, Mina was already crying, covering her face with her hands in a useless attempt to block out the truth. "Dead," Mistress Geraldine said as she rummaged in a far cupboard. The sound of her dragging glass jars across the wooden shelves was almost deafening in the empty room, where only one other member of the order, Lennox, remained. He sat at the edge of Mina's bed, but not even his familiar presence was enough to comfort her. "His body's still warm," the healer went on. "It can't have happened long ago, a few minutes, at most." She hesitated. "Mina says she saw it." Lennox stiffened, and a hand fell softly to Mina's shoulder. She flinched. "A hard thing to witness," her mentor said quietly. "I've been witnessing it for days," Mina replied in a monotone. "Mina," he sounded, as if he wanted to believe her, but still couldn't bring himself to. "How many times do I have to tell you?" she snapped, frustration and fear warring in her voice. "I've seen it ever since the first time I opened my eyes, after Mistress Geraldine, after she tugged into my head." Mina stopped, swallowed, and began again. "I saw it again this morning as I washed up." Taking a shaky breath, she added, "I knew it was going to happen tonight." She pulled away from her instructor, more tears creeping out from under her blindfold. "I told you I saw him dying, and now it's come true. God, it's come true, exactly the way it happened in the vision." Her mentor didn't reply. Mistress Geraldine, already assembling the materials she would need to prepare the body, broke the silence. "Something needs to be done," she said at last, just as the quiet was growing unbearable. She didn't need to say more. Mina knew what her words implied. Something needed to be done about her. "What then?" Master Disciple Lennox asked, getting to his feet. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again," Geraldine replied. "We need to contact the conjurer." "So they can study her?" Lennox demanded. "Or worse, so they can enslave her?" "So they can help her," the healer insisted. "Hells, even she thinks it should be done." "It should," Mina said in a shaky voice, staring up in what she hoped was her mentor's direction. "I need help, and if they can give it to me, I'll take it." "Mina," Lennox began, "I don't think you understand." "Stop telling me I don't understand," she cried, getting to her feet, her arms extended in front of her, lest she run into one of them. "You don't understand. The conjurer exists for a reason." She shook her head, clenching her fists. Rules were meant to be followed. Even Sloak understood that in the end, and so did she. "It's against the law to keep this from them, so why are we even debating it?" She didn't bother to mention the equally pressing motive, that, barring some errant celestial dragon arriving to save the day, the conjurer might be the only ones who could fix what was wrong with her. Because there was something wrong with her. Terribly, terribly wrong. Her mentor sighed, and Mina could practically see him pinching the bridge of his nose.
I'll take it up with the remaining 2 elders, he said at last. But until Sloke's replacement is chosen, I doubt that they'll reach a consensus. Elder Snowthorn has always been pro-conjury, and Elder Nynx is a temple separatist. Without Sloke's vote to break the tie, there won't be a decision. Mina bit her lip. Can't you see this isn't about opinions? She wanted to shout. The decision is clear. Hells, there shouldn't even need to be a decision. But she didn't. Instead, she bowed her head, gave a brisk nod, and replied, Very well, Master Disciple. Let me know what the elders say. As if she didn't know already, they would assure her a decision was coming, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But they hadn't witnessed what she had. They wouldn't have to go to sleep this morning with images of shadowy suffering dancing behind their eyelids, or wake up tomorrow wondering who would be the next to go. They didn't have to close their eyes for fear of what they would see if they opened them. Lennox exchanged a few more words with the healer, but Mina was no longer listening. Her mind was racing. Before her mentor had even left the room, she was making a decision of her own. She would need to wait until Mistress Geraldine left, but as it turned out, she didn't need to wait long. Several other attendants arrived, and together they lifted Sloke's corpse from the bed before carrying it solemnly from the room. I'll have to see to the body, Geraldine said, pausing in the doorway. I'll be in the preparation room across. You just sit here and rest. And if you need anything, call. Especially if you have another of your, visions, Mina supplied. Thank you, Mistress Geraldine. I will. But she intended to do no such thing. And as soon as the healer was out of the room, Mina was on her way out as well. The aviary was at the far end of the temple grounds. It was the second tallest building, edged out only by the observatory tower, but most acolytes didn't venture near it. It wasn't exactly the ideal place to meditate and contemplate the goddess. The words were as smelly as they were noisy, but for Mina's current purposes, they suited her just fine. The tricky part was getting there. If someone saw her slinking around, there would be questions, likely resulting in a one-way trip back to the infirmary. The blindfold would draw additional attention, which was why Mina removed it and stuffed it into the pocket of her trousers. Keeping her eyes on the ground, she stuck to the shadows and prayed that the other initiates, especially Tidar and Warred, were otherwise occupied. And this, at least, luck was on her side, and she made it to the foreyard without being stopped. The night air was sweet and cool against her face as she skirted around the outer structures, picking her way over the stony grounds towards the tall, narrow structure that housed the temple babblebirds. The door hung crooked on its hinges, opening into a narrow spiral staircase, and slipping through was easy enough. Safely inside the aviary, Mina patted against the straw-covered wooden floor, every footstep kicking up dust and stirring the musty air. In the rafters high overhead, the 6 babblebirds belonging to the temple sat in a line, their feathers ruffled haughtily and their heads tucked under their wings. They weren't particularly large creatures, about the size of big chickens, but they required enough space to warrant their own building, especially given their tendency to go flapping about the room when the mood struck them. Mina clapped her hands together. Psst, she called up to the roosting birds. Hey! A couple of the babblebirds raised their heads, looking put off as they shuffled further back into the shadows. Down here, Mina called, a little more insistently this time, snapping her fingers. Down here, echoed the one on the right, in perfect imitation of her voice. They weren't kept as songbirds, and for good reason. Their cries were shrill and grating when not duplicating something they had been told. But that wasn't what made them special. Enchanted while they were still nesting chicks, they were gifted with the ability to repeat what was said to them verbatim, in a perfect mimicry, along with a sense of navigation that was downright spectacular. The magic required was highly specialized, and the conjurer only licensed a handful of breeders each year. The birds made ideal messengers, able to locate even the most far-flung destinations. Most larger settlements, those who could afford them at least, kept at least 1 or 2 of them on hand. By the time the other disciples realized one of theirs was missing, the message would already be in the hands of the conjurer. Come on, Mina insisted, holding out her arm as she had seen the senior disciples do on more than one occasion. I have a message for you. The babblebird who had spoken scrutinized for another moment before swooping down in a blur of indigo feathers. Come on, it echoed. I have a message for you. Come on, I have a message for you. Come on, I have... That's it, Mina said as the creature landed on her arm.
giving her an excellent view of its black plumed head, a beak reminiscent of a tropical bird's, and a wise, deep blue eyes that peered out from those dark feathers. As it had with all the others, an image immediately began to form, written in black smoke. The bird took wing, only to be snapped up by a whiptail weaverin, its shadowy fur gleaming as it crushed its prey in its fanged jaws. Feathers flew as the small messenger was swiftly devoured. Mina flinched, aware that she should have been expecting this, but unable to help a twinge of disappointment. Not even animals were exempt from the visions, it seemed. The babblebird cocked its head at her, looking it squarely in the face, doing her best to peer through the vision of its eventual death. Mina cleared her throat and began to recite the message she had rehearsed on her way over. I am a member of the Temple of Celestriona on Mount Basraden. Something has happened here, a magical accident, and it has affected one of the students here in strange ways. As is required by law, we are reporting the incident to you, so that one of your representatives can come investigate the situation. There. Short, sweet, and to the point. She didn't pause for breath until she'd finished, and her heart leaped in her chest as the babblebird repeated her message back to her. There's still time to take it back, she thought. You don't have to send it. But she silenced that voice. She was suffering, and this was important. More important than Master-Disciple Lennox could possibly know. Sloke's last words to her rang in her ears. I chose my path, just like you will have to choose yours. And that, more than anything, was what kept her from second-guessing herself. She couldn't afford to make the mistakes he had made. She couldn't afford to believe that the elders would bring her a miracle cure. This was a matter of law, and if her superiors in the order wouldn't follow it, then she would take matters into her own hands. She was doing the right thing. She was sure of it. At least, that was what she told herself. Carrying the babblebird to the aviary door, she pushed it open with her foot. Take your message to the nearest conjury outpost, she instructed the babblebird, and tossed her arm up. The bird took off over the mountainside, and with a few flaps of its wings, it had disappeared to where Mina's eyes could no longer follow. Chapter 14. Seth. Seth could only watch in disbelief as the twin brothers strode inside, terror and confusion gluing him to the spot. Why were they here? What was Darcon doing away from the mountain? Why was his brother with him? The young disciple was still dressed in his lightweight robes, his face unmistakable. Bragon stood next to him, and although they were identical twins, he was Darcon's opposite in nearly every other way. A mop of long brown hair, stringy with road dirt and river mud, hung down past Bragon's shoulders, and he had a look of tranquil mysticism about him that was at odds with his brother's ever-present scowl. The distinctive tattoos marking him as a member of the Dark River Agorist clan ran down his face like black tears, and he was practically drowning in heavy furs and rough-spun wools. This was all of little note. What was concerning, however, was a wooden cudgel that dangled from Bragon's hip, no doubt capable of breaking noses and smashing bones with ease. Seth's first day back in the shadow of Mount Basraden, and who should walk into this very tavern? He might even have laughed if he weren't panicking. This time, it wasn't the tattoos that got him moving. It was his own nerves. Get out of here. Stand up and leave. Go! Getting to his feet was like wading through molasses, and Seth's heart sank as he scanned the room for a secondary exit. There was none. Crippled by indecision, he hesitated. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Darcon's eyes swept the room, and Seth's heart stopped when they landed on him, only to pass over him a moment later. The thaumaturge's shadow disguised at the temple had been enough. The boy didn't recognize him. Still, it wouldn't do to push his luck. As soon as the twins were seated, he would quietly excuse himself and retreat like the coward he was. The brothers were talking in low voices as they settled at a table on the other side of the room. Darcon sat with his back to Seth, with Bragon across from him. The young Agorist glanced in Seth's direction, and as his eyes landed on him, a horrible truth dawned on the thaumaturge. He supposed it could be called bad luck, or maybe the insanity of his markings. Then again, maybe it was just sheer stupidity on Seth's part. Whatever it was, it didn't change a damn thing. He may have been in shadowy disguise at the temple, but he hadn't been during his first encounter with Bragon, when he had first began posing as a messenger. Bragon's gaze drifted away from Seth, just as his brother's had, only to snap back in a double take. He frowned, staring, first in confusion, and then in startled recognition. Seth could sense the moment of coming conflict. The Agor's expression hardened in an instant, and then he leaned in closer to his brother to murmur something. Darcon turned around then, craning his neck to look in Seth's direction. The exact same expression, first confusion, then recognition, crossed on his face too. For the first time since they had entered, they truly looked like the twins they were. Darcon moved to stand, but Bragon grabbed his wrist, murmuring something as he stole another glance at Seth. The thaumaturge watched, his heart in his throat, as Darcon reluctantly sat back down. The brothers' conversation resumed, but the temple initiate didn't stop looking over his shoulder. Clenching his jaw, Seth reached for his sword and drew it quietly from its sheath before laying it across his lap under the table. He only had to wait for the right moment to make a break for it. Adrenaline was making his fingers twitch, goosebumps rippling up and down his scarred arms, and his near-empty stomach clenched when Darcon shook his brother off and stood up. Eyes on Seth, the monastery acolyte stalked across the room, anger radiating out of him in waves. "Not here," Bragon began, but his brother ignored him, and the Agor was left with no choice but to follow. Seth stifled a wince. Darcon came to a stop in front of the thaumaturge, his discipline nowhere near enough to calm his obvious anger. His arms were rigid against his side, his expression one of unbridled fury as he stared at the target of his rage. When the youth finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Tell me your name." It wasn't a request. Seth steeled himself, weighing his options and running cold calculations before throwing out the first name he could think of. "Revi," he replied, willing himself to sound truthful. "At most places they call me Revi, but Mama always called me Revenlot." He looked from one brother to the next, playing up his confusion even as anxiety roared within him. His skin seared and popped. It took everything he had not to scratch at it. "We, know each other or something?" Darcon's mouth curled in disdain. "Nice try," he growled, his hands balling up into fists. "You've got some nerve, Revi. You may have lost the beard, but I recognize your voice. My brother recognizes your face. You're Leth, and if you try to deny it, I'll kill you right here and now." "Darcon," Bragon said, glancing around at the various battle-hardened men that filled the tavern. Many were still deep in their cups, but a few had looked up and were watching the exchange with vague interest. The Agor put his hand on his brother's arm again, but Darcon shook him off. "You're the son of a bitch who broke into the observatory near 3 weeks ago," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you did to Mina? Do you?" He stepped forward, and Seth's grip on his sword hilt tightened. He didn't reply. "They don't know what's wrong with her," Darcon continued, his voice breaking a little. "But she's sick. First, seeing things. You ruined her life just like you've ruined mine." Seth stole a glance at the door. If he ran now, she might not ever become a celestial dragon now, thanks to you, Darcon spat, oblivious. "I know I won't. Not as long as you've got my constellation scroll. They kicked me out of the order. Did you know that?" He turned to his brother, throwing up a hand in disgust. "You were right about everything. He used you to get to me." "I've had no idea what you're on about," Seth insisted, the muscles at the back of his throat clenching painfully. He didn't want to hear this, didn't want to listen to all the ways he had destroyed these people's lives. Destroying his own was bad enough. Darcon's anger seemed to be rubbing off on his brother, and Seth realized, with an unpleasant sinking feeling, that he would get no reprieve from either of them. "I should have figured it was too good to be true," the Agorist apprentice said scornfully. "I'll deliver a letter to your brother at no charge. I'm heading that way anyway. Everyone's out for themselves around here, right?" He shook his head, just looking for the next con. "That's not true," Seth retorted, but it fell on deaf ears. "You coward. You won't even own up to it," Darcon demanded, his voice rising. "You ruined everything, and you can't even admit to it." At the next table over, the sellswords had begun whispering amongst themselves, nodding at the ongoing confrontation. "What's going on there, little ladies?" the largest of the three called across the room to them. "You offering your services? A little backdoor action, and he's wanting none of it." The others snickered. Darcon shot the man a heated look. "Keep running your mouth, and I'll bust the teeth out of it." "He's just angry," one of the other sellswords chimed in.
He only charges coppers, and can't even get Fat Boy there to give him 2. Lift up that robe, the other shouted. Let me see what you're working with. Maybe I'll match the price. The men howled with laughter, several of the other patrons joining in, and Darcon went 3 separate shades of furious red. He turned his attention back to Seth, ignoring his wounded masculinity. Give me back my scroll, and maybe I won't wring your god's damned neck. We're gonna have none of that in here, the innkeep yelled from behind the counter, clearly weary of brewing scuffle. Yeah, that's what I thought. The big mercenary wasn't done snipping at the boy. Ignoring the innkeep's warnings, he swayed drunkenly to his feet. No needin' to look under your robe to know you ain't got no balls. He flopped back into his chair. His fellow sellswords were flying. I'm not warning you again, the man behind the bar shouted across the room. Start any shit in here, and I'll have you all out on your asses. Okay, Seth said, desperate, motioning for the 2 boys to sit. Okay, just sit down. Let's talk about this. Talk about it? Darcon shouted, his knuckles slamming into the stained wooden tabletop. What should we talk about, huh? How you stole what wasn't yours? How you put my best friend in the infirmary? How you're a liar and a thief? Should we talk about how I had to reach out to Bragon for a place to live and pray that Augurs would take in an apprentice 6 years past recruitment age? They banished me from the temple. I can't even show my face there anymore. Listen, Seth hissed, checking on the barkeep, who was wavering near the front of the counter, looking as if he might come out onto the floor. Dozens of eyes were now boring into them from all around the room. Sit down, lower your voice, let's talk like adults. He couldn't afford to end up on the street with the 2 teenagers. If he had to resort to using magic, someone was liable to end up dead. Darcon smiled humorously, shaking his head slowly. No. You've done enough talking. I've got a better plan for you. Leth, Revi, whatever the hell's your name is. If I can get my scroll back and return the armillary box, maybe they'll let me back in. A shadow of doubt flickered across his face, but it was gone in an instant, overpowered by renewed motivation. Handing over the person responsible wouldn't hurt either, Bragon added, his expression stony. The tavern had fallen silent, the tension unbearably high. That's not possible, Seth protested. I can't give you any of that crap back, because I don't have it anymore. That stuff is already on its way to the prison on Tide Island. And unless you want to risk traveling there, you're never going to see it again. The answer was harsh, but it was the truth. He'd sent his ill-gotten gains off to that hellhole not long after coming down from the mountain. Not that that was much consolation to the twins. Tide Island? Bragon asked incredulously, stepping forward. We're supposed to believe you work for the Conjurer? I don't work for them, Seth replied without hesitation. But the stuff is gone. Darcon crossed his arms. Maybe we should send you back there, too. Seth shook his head, unfazed. I'm never going back to Tide Island, and if you're smart, you won't go anywhere near it either. The brothers exchanged a dubious look. He has a point, Bragon acknowledged. Magic doesn't work there. We would be sitting ducks. Even if we made it to the prison, the Conjurer would kill us on sight for trespassing. If we weren't already killed by the... He swallowed, blanching a little. The monsters, Seth finished for him, seizing on his fear like a hound on a scent. The toxic plants, the cultists, the roving warlords. Take your pick, believe me. Those prison walls are as much to keep what's outside out as to keep what's inside in. Hells. That was an understatement, and Seth knew it all too well. Aside from the settlements on the outer edges of the island, the place was utterly without governance or rule of law. Nothing but treacherous wilderness populated with the stuff nightmares were made of. The locals, tough as nails and accustomed to the lack of magic, were leery of outsiders at best, and downright hostile at worst. Understandable, he had to admit. It took a miracle to find a skipper willing to sail there, and few who ventured into those jungles were ever seen again. There was a reason the Conjurer had built its prison so deep in the forest. As horrible as life was within its confines, it paled in comparison to what else lurked on the island. He turned back to Darcon. I'm sorry, he said, and some part of him genuinely meant it. The box and your scroll are out of your reach. You're better off drawing up a new one. Darcon's face was a mask of rage. It's irreplaceable.
Don't you get that? The stars change. They'll never be in the same position as they were the night it was drawn. The night I joined the Order. You have ruined my life." Seth could only sigh and shrug his shoulders, which seemed to push the former initiate over the edge. Darcon lunged forward, trying to pull him across the table, but Seth drew his blade. It gleamed softly in the dim lights, prompting an uneasy murmur among the other patrons. "It's 2 against 1, Bragon reasoned. You should sheathe that and come away before this gets worse for you." "That's it," the bartender shouted from across the room. "Take it outside, all of you." The twins glanced at one another in silent debate before shuffling back towards the exit, their eyes burning in the lamplight as they disappeared out the door. They would be waiting for him to emerge, Seth knew. "All of you," the bartender repeated, jabbing a finger in Seth's direction. "Out, now, while I still have some patience left in me." Seth was already looking around, his eyes darting over to the rowdy mercenaries. It didn't have to be 2 against 1, not while he had gold in his purse. It wasn't a perfect plan, but if it got the twins off his back long enough for him to flee. Turning to face the sellswords, he grabbed his coin pouch and shook it. "How'd you boys like to teach those 2 a lesson, and make some coin to boot?" The mercenaries exchanged a look, and then the leader cackled. "Sounds like fun," he replied, and the 3 of them got to their feet. Seth shouldered his pack and sheathed his sword, already on his way over to their table. "Not in my tavern," the barkeep protested, reaching for a sword on the wall behind him. Seth ignored him. More nervous murmurs had begun to bubble up amongst the patrons. A few blades came out of the mercenary sheaths as the thaumaturge dumped a pile of gold coins onto their tabletop. The one in charge scooped them up. "They're just boys," Seth reminded them with a look at the weapons they had pulled. "A regular old beating should be more than enough." "Don't you worry," one of the others replied, shoving his knife back into its leather sheath and clapping him hard on the shoulder. "We'll straighten them out, all right." Seth only had a second to doubt his decision before the sellswords, already whooping drunkenly, were heading out onto the street. Almost immediately, the sounds of battle began to filter in through the open door. Telltale shouts and grunts of pain as knuckles met chins and knees met stomachs. Returning to his table, Seth lingered long enough to toss some more coins down for the uneaten food. Every eye was still on him as he crept to the doorway, suddenly uncertain. They were just boys, and he had thrown them to the wolves. Shame coloring his cheeks, Seth peered out onto the street. Chaos was unfolding, and the mercenaries had surrounded the brothers, forcing them to fight back to back. Darcon was a flurry of strikes and kicks, while Bragon was throwing that cudgel of his around for all he was worth. But it wasn't hard to see that the battle-hardened mercenaries had the advantage, and the armor. Seth didn't wait around to watch, rushing out into the quickly encroaching night and circling around to where his horse was tied up. More grunts of pain and exertion followed as he climbed into the saddle. It was just as he was turning his horse around, preparing to disappear into the evening, when he found himself staring, stunned, at the scene unfolding in front of him. Impossible. But it wasn't. Somehow, the boys had managed to escape the circle of mercenaries, and in the span of a few seconds, the tide had turned. Darcon had the leader locked in an armbar, and was using him to force the second mercenary backward, just in time for Bragon to deliver a mighty blow to his arm, prompting a howl of pain and a string of drunken curses. Whirling around, he put his cudgel between himself and the third sellsword, who had taken a step back to avoid suffering the same fate. The twins now looked like they were going to win the brawl. Seth sat back in his saddle, impressed in spite of himself. Whatever else they were, the boys were clearly not cowards. Shaking his head in disbelief, he took hold of his reins and guided his horse towards the road. He was about to kick his heels into its flanks when the threat came, slurred with whiskey and rage. "I'll kill you for this, you no good lot." Whirling back around, Seth watched as the leader, his pride clearly wounded, threw Darcon off with an alcohol-fueled heave of effort. Darcon went stumbling into his brother, and although he kept his footing, Bragon didn't. The second sellsword, still cradling his busted arm, took the opportunity to bring his boot heel down on the young Augur's wrist. Hard. Bones snapped, and Bragon cried out in anguish, pulling his arm to his chest. Shit. Seth had been in enough scrapes to know when things were going from rough to dangerous. Urging his horse forward, he shouted, I want them going to a healer, not an undertaker. But it was no use. Tempers were running too high. Yelling in anger, Darcon rounded on the mercenary leader and closed on him once more. The third Celestriona made a grab for him, and Darcon drove his elbow directly into the mercenary's eyes. The man screamed, flailing his arms as Darcon struck him again, this time in the jaw. That was when the leader unsheathed his dagger. For a moment, that seemed at once instantaneous and eternal, it caught the evening glow, gleaming like a sliver of living fire. The fight had just turned deadly. "No!" Seth yelled. Dropping the reins, he extended his hands, gritting his teeth as he drew upon the magic residing in his skin. His palms began to glow, but before he could unleash the energy, the mercenary leader buried his blade in Darcon's back. The boy staggered forward, looking stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Then he fell,